Welcome to the Sustainability Insights podcast, hosted by the School of Social and Environmental Sustainability at the University of Glasgow. My name is Amy, and today I'm talking with Dr. Anna de Jong, Senior Lecturer at the University of Glasgow's Dumfries campus. We're going to be talking about over-tourism, exactly what that means, and how we might work towards preventing it.
Hey Amy, thanks for having me.
Great to have you today. Thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to be talking about over-tourism today, yes?
Yeah.
So before we get into that, I want to find out a little bit more about you and what you're up to. So I do this with everyone. We're doing 3, 2, 1. So 3 areas of research that you're interested in, 2 things, just 2, that you're working on at the minute, and 1 thing that you want people listening to this to take away from this conversation. So I'll start with 3.
Sure. Yeah, go. Well, actually, my research is focused on 3 areas, or 3 very broad areas that I work on. At least that's what I say to people, so that works well. So the first of which I'm really interested in the role of food tourism in making places, in how places are developed through food tourism and how that changes people's understanding of place.
Ah, okay.
And then should I?
Yeah, tell me more. I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated.
So this started, so when I first moved over to the UK from Australia, I worked on a food tourism project up in Lochaber in the Scottish Highlands.
Yes, I know exactly where you are.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And that was an amazing experience because there was lots of really interesting small entrepreneurial businesses that worked with food from the place, from the landscape, and that had become over a series of years a really strong aspect of the tourism development in that area. So the project was looking at different case studies across Europe, but I was working on the Scottish case study, and it was working with those food tourism entrepreneurs to see how that kind of aligned with this kind of broader understanding of place and how tourists engaged with place in Lochaber.
That's so interesting. That's so cool. And so I cut you off there. So 2 more things.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the other 2. So that actually led to the second thing, which so through that, working with entrepreneurs in the tourism industry, I became really interested in the particular role or experiences of women entrepreneurs within the tourism industry, and have been involved in different projects looking at that, both in West Africa, in Spain, and in the UK as well.
Ah, so cool. Yeah. So cool. Oh, that's brilliant. Fantastic. And then one more thing?
And the third thing is actually, it's aligned in a way, still interested in this idea of tourism development, but taking a kind of broader look around the role of tourism development, which is so often used as a way to regenerate economies, particularly in peripheral areas, so rural areas like Lochaber in the Scottish Highlands, but also cities that have experienced industrial decline and things like that. Tourism's often proposed as a way to kind of regenerate places. So I'm really interested in that from a policy perspective, but then how that also leads to ideas around sustainability and more recently issues related to over-tourism as well.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. So, 2 things, if you can pick only 2. Because you sound very, very busy and lots of interest there. So 2 things that you are working on right now.
Yeah, so that's really tough.
Yeah, I know.
When you ask me, I'm like, ooh, 2. So I suppose I can say something that's kind of coming to an end and then something that's just starting. It's a way to nail it down.
Yeah.
So one thing that's coming to an end is some work related to the food tourism theme that I work with, and some stuff that we did in Norway a few years ago. This was a bit more of a kind of interesting personal area that we kind of did with a group of colleagues that had become quite close friends. So we were in Norway anyway, and we did some work around Smalahove. I don't know if you've heard of Smalahove
No, I've not.
before.
What is this?
It's a traditional Norwegian dish that's prepared in the lead up to Christmas in the Advent period.
Oh, okay.
And it's basically a sheep's head.
Oh, that's not what I expected you to say.
I didn't think that was what you were going to think. That's where you thought I was going with it.
Okay,
but basically, so it's really got a really strong kind of heritage and nostalgia. but also it's become a tourist attraction.
Right, of well,
where people will go there either for heritage purposes, but also as a way to engage with kind of the idea of the other, which is a really strong thing that comes up in tourism experiences, like the tourist experience time and time again within the literature. Often as tourists, when we're traveling, we want to engage with something else, something that's new, quite different. And something that might challenge us, something that we might frame as kind of even kind of maybe perceived as disgusting, depending on who we are and what our own identity is. So we were really interested in how tourists engage with this dish as a tourist practice, and what sorts of ideas are brought up, and how, and even the material engagement, the bodied engagement of what it means to eat something that you don't normally eat.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
So
that's amazing.
Yeah. So that's something that's coming to an end. And then the other side of the coin, something that's starting is a project that's looking at over-tourism, tourism development and sustainability through different case studies. So one will be the Isle of Skye, another one Gotland in Sweden, and Tenerife in the Canary Islands. So they're three very different cases.
Very different places, aren't they?
Yeah, and they were selected quite deliberately. Obviously, there's a lot of kind of justifications and reasons why you select case studies, but we were particularly interested in how different destinations are at different steps in terms of tourism and have different engagement with this idea of over-tourism and experiencing the challenges of tourism. So Tenerife is obviously a place that for a long time has been very open in terms of its approach to tourism development and has reduced a lot of the barriers to developing tourism, and as such it's become a massive tourism destination.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Isle of Skye, it's in the lead up to the pandemic, it was starting to see some of the same challenges around over-tourism, but in very different ways to Tenerife. But it's not as well-known a destination, but it had been kind of...
I remember the headlines and Skye is full and, you
exactly. Turn back now, the bridge is closed. Yeah, exactly. So those conversations were really starting and had been kind of increasing over the last few years. And then Gotland, which is a small island. Sorry, I keep on knocking that. So Gotland's a small island off the coast of Sweden near Stockholm in the Baltic Sea. And it's an area that has some similarities to Skye, but hasn't had necessarily those same conversations around the concerns of over-tourism. So in its tourism policy, it's still very much focused on trying to attract high numbers of tourists to the area, but they're just beginning to think about what this means for water supply, for the housing opportunities for people who have lived in Gotland for a long period of time and might want to buy a house there, and those sorts of things.
Wow, amazing. Also going to be very, very busy then, I'm
sure.
I can't wait to hear all about that though. That's fantastic. And great that we're having this conversation today then, all about over-tourism and kind of actually what that means for, not just where we are, but all these different places and how that might maybe impact people differently and at different stages of it. So I'm so excited to find out more about this.
Cool.
So finally then, what one thing that you want people following this conversation that we're having today, what do you want people to take away from this conversation?
I mean, obviously I hope people take away so many things, we'll see. But I think at the very foundations, we're all tourists, in some way we all make decisions about where we travel, whether we're frequent travelers or whether we go on a holiday, once every couple of years. And through that, we can all be mindful around what that actually means for the destinations and most importantly for the residents and the environmental landscapes in which we actually visit and how we engage in those places. So what does it mean, for example, to go to Tenerife and how do we engage with a place like Tenerife and things like that. So and how that contributes to these overall kind of broader issues that the tourism industry and places are experiencing as a result of increased tourism.
Oh, amazing. Yes. Well, let's dive straight in then. And let's talk a little bit about, first of all, this concept of over-tourism. How do we actually define over-tourism? And I suspect we might have to kind of take a little step back and work out how we got to this place in the first place. But I mean, I mean, can you start us off with how do we define over-tourism? What does it mean?
Yeah. I mean, over-tourism as a concept, as a term, really started to come up in the few years leading up to the pandemic, when, as you mentioned, Sky before, with the headlines in some mainstream news article, mainstream media sources were highlighting just the sheer numbers of people that were visiting kind of very small popular destinations. And that's when this kind of idea of over-tourism came into existence. Basically, the idea that we're beyond carrying capacity within a destination. There's too many people that are visiting this place, and it's starting to have really severe impacts, and that are much more than just kind of one-off impacts. But of course, that's not a new thing by any means. It didn't suddenly start experiencing this kind of concern around over-tourism just in the last few years. I mean, you can take it right back to the 1960s. Well, that's often how the narrative is described around concerns relating to over-tourism, because what was happening at that time was, particularly in Europe, there was an increase in what we call the leisure society. So all of us, kind of increasingly, people had disposable incomes, and they were looking for different ways to use that extra money that they might have had within the household. And leisure practices, leisure experiences became a really important aspect of that. And there were all sorts of associations around what it means to be someone who can kind of travel. It became a really strong cultural status symbol.
Yeah, if you have the means to leave the country and go somewhere else or go and travel, then
Exactly. And that also relates to the ideas around work and the kind of the structure of the 9-to-5 working week, and the idea that we're working really hard within this capitalist system. So we need to, use our 4 weeks annual leave and our Saturdays and Sundays to get away from this kind of everyday humdrum of life. So people were looking to travel more, basically.
Travel, see something different.
Exactly.
Relax.
Relax, or see something exotic, or, travel for all sorts of reasons. But they could actually do that. They had the means to do that economically. And then from a policy perspective or a governance perspective, regions started to recognize the potential economic income that could be derived from these people who were looking for places to visit. So then you have this opening up of, or really decent kind of reduction in the formalities around around policy to facilitate businesses, tourism businesses, basically. And different places responded to that opportunity in different ways. So Spain, for example, is obviously a famous example where they saw the potential of tourism and made it really, really easy for businesses to create an industry. So to create infrastructure around tourism, in the construction industry, a lot of regulation was reduced to make it really easy to build places for visitors to come, big resorts, big hotels, that sort of thing. And in the airline industry, that was another area where there was a lot of deregulation, which, say reducing taxes, making it like really incentivizing airlines to create flight paths to certain places. So in Spain, for example, if you, with the Canary Islands, if you remove taxes, if you then that created a space for cheap airlines to come in eventually, which came in the 90s. So over time, as destinations, as governments realize more and more about the potentials, the economic income that could be derived through tourism, we see increasing numbers of tourism from the 1960s right up until just before the pandemic happened.
Wow.
So
so
into the millions.
I had no idea about the kind of policy. I mean, obviously I expected they would have to change some policy to allow that, but to actually change construction regulations or that seems so...
It goes right through. And that's the thing that's really interesting about tourism, because often we think of it as a discrete industry that sits separate, but it's so interwoven into places. It connects to all aspects of a place, housing, employment, education. You have to create educational opportunities in a certain place in order to facilitate the industry, the construction industry, the agriculture, food and beverage. It really connects to everything.
How kind of changing that policy would then impact people residents, for example. So if they're changing policy to allow for all these tourist attractions or buildings to pop up and deregulating that a little bit, how did that have a knock-on effect for the residents, or how were they impacted?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes, yeah. And that's why my background's in geography, so I'm particularly interested in the uniqueness of places. So it happens, things come together and intersect in such unique ways depending on the destination, and no destination is exactly the same as any other. So yes, of course, residents are affected, but the ways in which they're actually affected and which communities within a destination are actually affected in different ways, it varies so much, and so much so that the tourism industry can actually facilitate or influence a complete demographic change of a destination, in the way that travelers or tourists aren't discrete entities themselves. They often become residents. They buy into the real estate there. They create their own B&Bs or second homes. They create their own communities often within a place if it's particularly attractive. So then that can slowly over time change into the demographics of a place. And then it becomes too expensive and not feasible for the original Indigenous population to remain in that place. So over time you often see a gentrification process that happens, and a moving out and a moving in, which completely changes the place, basically.
Absolutely, And so we've talked a little bit about how kind of ramping up to the pandemic, we've seen this kind of over tourism. How do you tell? At what point can you say this is now a problem? What are the markers there for us to be able to recognize something maybe isn't quite right? Or I think you've really hit on an interesting point there, because it's there's a politics to it, isn't there? And even the Isle of Skye that you mentioned with concerns around over-tourism, there's a diversity of opinions around whether they were actually experiencing over-tourism and what over-tourism actually looks like, and that's why it's such an interesting area of research, but that's also why it's such an important area of research, from my opinion at least. That's why I do the work, because you have to unpack that politics and think about who benefits from that, and often the people who are influenced by the policy, the policy, it happens on the ground in a way in place, but often it's not. It's happening in other places. And there's a disconnect often with the residents and the everyday experience of what it is to live in a place that's experiencing high levels of tourism. So even in my own work, there's not a clear marker or indicator, although other academics would say that there are, So, but even that, where those lines are and what's too much or too little is such a difficult thing to say. And then also it's very hard to manage or pull back from this kind of very messy industry that's completely embedded within a place. So then what do you actually do when a place becomes deemed to have over tourism or too many tourists? How do you actually pull that back? And that totally ties into what you said earlier about tourism being so interconnected or so kind of interwoven to so many different aspects that you're right. Like, how do you then pick out where the problem bits are, the bits that maybe aren't working? How do you actually unpick that? And how do you do that? Can you tell us?
There's a lot of interesting examples around how you try to do that. In Scotland there's been changes to, it also becomes how that problem becomes defined.
Exactly.
So in often what's seen to be the case with over tourism is that often Airbnb becomes the target. And it is. It obviously plays a really huge role in facilitating affording over tourism within particular places, because it allows a lot more people to stay in a certain area then would have been available when we had just the formal tourism industry. So the hotels, the B&B, guest houses. Exactly. That's much more easy to regulate in a way. But as soon as people start opening up their homes or their bedrooms, that then becomes really difficult to manage. So that's often why Airbnb does become a focus. So there's been regulations around making sure Airbnb hosts pay tax, for example, how many nights per year they can open up their house or their accommodation, those sorts of things. And there's interesting examples around the world around how that's being done.
Mm-hmm.
But it is also much more than that, because the challenge is that there's still a huge the challenge is in the behavior as well, because people are still trying to travel more and more as frequently as possible, and see as many places as possible. That's such a huge part of our contemporary culture as well.
Definitely.
And people will still kind of want, and at the same time, beyond that, there's still often a huge focus fundamentally within a lot of policy around focusing on an increase in tourism numbers. So it kind of, we can't just focus on Airbnb.
No, absolutely not. So one thing, I would very slightly touch on this, but I want to kind of explore a little bit about, I suppose, the elephant in the room of something big that impacted the tourism industry, which would be the pandemic. And we've talked about it ramping up just before the pandemic. Obviously, then COVID, how does that, I mean, we obviously know kind of from a high level how that affected everything. Everything's shut down, everything's then stopped. But has that had a lasting impact? How can we understand that impact? I mean, I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the pandemic was incredibly devastating for the tourism industry internationally. And it really showed the vulnerabilities of the industry. And it's how quickly
absolutely.
the market can stop, the business just stops. And also it's, often it's seen as a private industry, but it's heavily reliant on government support as well, as we saw in the pandemic, because of its vulnerabilities. Because, we've seen that on a small scale before, if a place had a natural disaster or, had experienced a terrorist attack or something like that, people stop visiting a place overnight, just like that. And that's
instantaneously something's changed.
That's the industry that's going to have long-lasting effects for an industry. But obviously this was on a international scale in a way that hadn't happened before. So that obviously has had huge lasting effects on the industry that is still being felt.
Definitely.
But at the same time, the other side of the coin of that was that there was a lot of optimism within some aspects of the industry around how we might build back better. This kind of conversation was happening a lot at that time in various areas, but particularly connected to the tourism industry, because a lot of destinations started to see the benefits of what happens when the tourists don't come. We saw, that in Venice was a really famous example when the canals, you could see that, there wasn't the sediment moving in the water and those sorts of things.
Water and the dolphins came back.
I
remember those stories.
But what we've actually seen is the kind of, I don't even know, just the dominance of and the prevalence of how strong it is for us to travel, our desire to travel, our need to travel for a whole heap of reasons, and also destinations, governments' reliance on that tourism dollar, basically. So even though there was all this optimistic discussion around how we might build that back better, what we've actually found is tourism numbers are not just going back to pre-2019, pre-2020 levels, they're actually increasing again.
Wow. Okay,
so it's reinforced this need to think about sustainable tourism again, or different, concerns around over-tourism, but also re-emphasised the fact that it's very difficult to do anything about it, because this kind of focus on increasing tourism numbers is so ingrained into our governance, and a desire to travel is so ingrained at the individual level as well.
Absolutely. So I mean, in terms of those kind of building back better thoughts, initiatives, plans? What are some kind of tangible things that we could be doing to build back better? Like, what are some real things that we could be doing?
Yeah. I mean, I think from a personal perspective, if we're thinking, you know, in a pragmatic sense, I think to be reflective around how many holidays we do take a year.
Yeah.
You know, I know that's really hard to do because we all feel like we need the break. And there's a lot of value that comes from traveling to a different culture and learning and engaging with a different place. But being reflexive about how often we actually travel, how far we travel.
Yeah.
You know, do we need to take a flight? Do we need to actually go to Spain or somewhere in Europe, or can we actually have that same experience supporting the local industry and traveling in a more sustainable way, or a way that has lower levels of emission than a flight might?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. Yeah, do we have to fly? You know, is there other options out there that we could
exactly, and can we go for longer, stay for longer, engage with the place for longer, but travel less? And can we take longer to get there? You know, is there a train that we could take and incorporate that into our journey? In Europe, there's a lot of focus within the transport industry around the potential of long train journeys and recreating the romanticization around what it means to travel by train, making that a really comfortable, luxurious experience that can actually some argue can save time, because you're not having to go to the airport, stay at an overnight hotel next to the airport. You know, you're using that overnight journey. You need to sleep anyway. You're using that overnight journey to get somewhere. You're having a unique experience. You're seeing the landscape as you move through it, and then you arrive at your destination.
That sounds ideal.
Yeah, it sounds ideal. It's very expensive though. Yeah. There's not many places you can do that to get to using that kind of method. But, you know, rethinking how we travel and how frequently we travel really is kind of what I would hope that we take away from this very small podcast.
Absolutely.
Might be too big an ask, but
no, we can do it.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I suppose another question I had was around when you're in the place, you know, we've traveled sustainably, hopefully, and we got there, being cognizant of maybe how we can behave better while we're there and in a more sustainable way. I mean, is there anything we can be doing in that respect?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot of different things we could be doing. I mean, it depends, and then it really depends on the destination, like, and what sorts of activities you're seeking to get up to, but trying to, you know, you don't want to demoralize any type of tourism, because they all have their value and their need, and there's different reasons that we travel. But if you were going to a resort and you stay within that resort, you don't engage with the local place, you're consuming food from other places, not from that destination, you're not kind of learning about the place, engaging with anyone from the place. You're not, you're using, you know, there's a lot of interesting research around how we actually use a lot more resources when we're traveling, because we take longer showers. There's a lot more food waste. We're happy to do a lot more kind of washing and use a new towel every day. All of those really little things, because we feel that we have a right to relax. You know, tourism's a hedonistic experience. Getting away from that kind of egocentric approach to us as travelers, and actually thinking, I'm a visitor in this place, how can I engage in this place in a way that's actually caring of the place, you know?
And we're not just going to a tourist destination, we're going to someone's home. We're
going to get something out of it for you as a tourist. You know, the more we think that this isn't about us, it's about engaging with the place, you know, and that sounds a bit highbrow sometimes, and it's not how we travel in a lot of instances, you know, but even on a small scale, doing that, it has a lot of value for the place. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Oh no, I was going to ask you what you hope people take away from this conversation again, and you know, kind of go back to our initial conversation. But I think that's it right there, isn't it? You know, we want people to think
a bit more about it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So where can people find out more information about this if they want to dig a little deeper?
Yeah, sure. So I'm part of the Glasgow Tourism Studies group. So that would be a really good place to start. And also the Geographies of Leisure and Tourism Research Group also has some really interesting research taking place on this topic.
Amazing, amazing. So we'll definitely make sure and share those, and so people can have a little look and a little read and find out a little bit more about over tourism.
Cheers. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you so much. Thank you.